And thank you to the staff who are on this call helping out and being panelists. If you were with us yesterday, welcome back. Those who are new today, welcome. You will be absolutely thrilled at our guests today. And before I start, I just wanted to reflect on a couple of things that I've heard over the last few days that have just really stuck with me. And one of them, when we talk about equity and diversity, and just thinking about what a teacher said, she said, no one had to teach me how to see and love white children. Why do we need to be taught how to do that with brown and Black children? And I'm thinking, wow, that really, really sat with me. And then the other thing that sat with me from yesterday was when you're accustomed to privilege, diversity and equity feels like oppression. So those are two things that I know, just keep those in mind as you listen to our incredible presenter today. And think about where we are, the work that we need to do, and why it is so important to the beautiful children in this country. So with that, I want to turn it over to our host, Dr. Dolores Comer-Zenon, member of NAME, and she will introduce the privilege that we have of having our guests today. So Dolores. Mute. I think you're on mute still, Dolores.
You know, I'm seeming to have that problem in several sessions, but I'm very excited. It is quite an honor to introduce our speaker for today. My name is Dr. Dolores Comer-Zenon, and I am a National Board Certified Teacher who hails from Louisiana. I'm here on behalf of the National Board Network of Minoritized Educators, and I'm very excited to engage in this conversation around Black and Brown children, around disrupting education, around liberating education, and a number of other words in context that we will discuss today. Our speaker today, Sharif El-Mekki, is a 27-year veteran educator who worked in 3 different public schools in West Philadelphia. In addition to his role as a teacher and administrator, El-Mekki has helped launch efforts like the Fellowship, Black Male Educators for Social Justice, Philly's 7th Ward blog, 8 Black Hands podcast, and the Center for Black Educator Development to address the experiences of the 23 million plus Black and Brown students in America's schools. This session today represents the disruptor model of social justice. And with that, I turn it over to my dear friend and colleague, Sharif El-Mekki. Sharif, I give it to you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you. I'm gonna, Richard, can you allow me to share my screen? Oh, I'm sorry, you have to unfreeze your.
I'm gonna stop sharing.
Right, there you go.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
I've stopped sharing, it's on you.
Yep, it's coming up. Okay, can you see it?
Yes.
All right. Well, let me just start off by saying I am grateful to be here. It's an honor. I'm gonna stop. I'm really sorry. Hold on. Hopefully this does the trick. Beautiful. All right. I'm so sorry about that. Again, I'm grateful, really grateful to be here. The National Board Digital Academy, NBA Academy it's just a vital source of encouragement for educators all around the country in their pursuit for national board certification. It's one of my biggest regrets across my 27 years that I did not pursue certification before I became a principal. And so I'm extremely grateful for the leadership of Ms. Brookins and other folks, as well as our host and my friend, Dr. Dolores. And, you know, just to be asked to talk about liberating education at this critical moment in our history is a tremendous honor. And I am grateful to have educators uh, that are part of this organization, as well as NAME, which just reminds me of the stellar educators who coached and mentored and developed me when I came into the profession. Again, my name is Sharif El-Mekki, and I founded the Center for Black Educator Development in 2019. And prior to that, launched the fellowship Black Male Educators for Social Justice. As Ms. Dolores said, was a teacher and a principal for 25 years across only 3 schools where I really got to dive deeply into the 3 communities that I served. That was a career changer. I began my career as an activist, hell-bent on learning how to pursue and implement social and racial and educational justice. And I started my career believing that the most effective thing that I could do was try to create lasting change in my community. And that was 27 years ago. And you know what? I still believe that. I have to apologize uh, to the National Board team because I originally told them I wanted to talk about disrupting education. But at some point, as I was working through this presentation, I really wanted to talk about liberating education. You know, and the main reason, because being disruptive has become this, you know, misunderstood concept in these streets and in these spaces. And, you know, and I think when I think about disrupting, I think about when I used to have ants in my kitchen and I would wipe it off. I'd use peppermint oil. I use all these things to disrupt, you know, them coming in through whatever crack they were coming in through. And so it was disruptive, but they came back over and over again. And so I just wanted to really challenge myself and as well as all of us that just like those ants will resurface, if we don't do things more liberating, more permanent, that, you know, white supremacy in our ecosystem will continue to return, evolve, reshape itself. And so I want to make sure that we're not talking about disrupting white supremacy in our educational ecosystem in the same way that I used to disrupt those ants in my kitchen. You know, and I believe to become
Sharif, I hate to step in. The slides aren't being viewed properly by our audience. I'm not sure if you see it, how you see it on your screen.
Yeah, I see.
But we see.
Okay. I'm going to stop sharing and then try again. I'm really sorry.
Yeah, I think it's
I'm sorry to interrupt you.
No, thank you for interrupting.
Are you able to do it? Did it?
How is it now? Can you see it?
Yeah.
If you go into presenter mode,
Now?
yeah, Sharif, that'll work.
Here at the top.
That'll work.
But click presenter mode on at the top right.
Next to the orange share.
Mm-hmm.
Next to the orange share.
Yeah.
No, way at the top. See the three bubbles of people? And then more to your right. But this could work as well. Is this okay? This is okay, correct, Richard?
This is fine, Sharif. If you just use the page down button, it should work to advance the slides as it is as well.
Can you see it? Did it just advance?
No, it's only on the title slide. Is it advancing for you on your screen?
Yes.
Is it possible I may assist?
Yeah. It says
You
give
have the
mouse
slides on you.
keyboard. Should I stop? I'm so sorry, guys.
If you stop sharing, then maybe we could share the one that's in the Google, in the Drive folder. Let me see if I can get it up. I think I have it up. I'm pretty sure I do.
Ladies and gentlemen, I just want to point out, and we're going to work this out for you, but we're so grateful to you for bearing with us. We've got a lot of people on the line, hundreds and hundreds of people, and this is going to be an amazing session. As they're working on the technology, I just want to say, I wish I could look at that bookshelf behind you, Sharif, and see all those books, because I know that there would be so much there that would be compelling.
Okay,
All right.
there we go.
All right. And again, my deepest apologies. In the run through earlier, it went fine. But if.
No worries. It's the world we're living in now.
Okay. Can you go back one for me? Okay, thank you. So again, just to to jump back in, I wanted to move away from the idea of disrupting right now, and really challenge us to think of it more radically, more permanently, to change the very experiences that Black and Brown students have. I believe to become the best educator activist I can be requires just this perpetual process of growth, process of continual research, discovery, reflection, and then action. Next slide, please. In the spirit, I hope you understand this slight shift. I've been just, again, thinking a lot about it. My friend Chris Stewart, one of our amazing co-hosts of the 8 Black Hands podcast, he often says, don't tell me about folks who wanted to reform slavery. Enslavement needs to be abolished, it's not reformed, right? And so the same thing with our students' experiences. Many of the hard conditions that Black and Brown children experience today don't need to be reformed. They don't need to be disrupted. They need to be abolished. So when we say liberate education, we're actually talking about dismantling racism permanently, not in a way where, just like the ants, they continue to return. Fighting social oppression and enforcing social, racial, and educational justice for the 20 million plus Black and Brown students in America's schools. Ms. Brookins' talk opened up with a reflection from a teacher that she heard saying that we didn't have to learn to love white children. And that's just so powerful, because I go to workshop after workshop after workshop speaking about how to look at the entire humanity of our Black and Brown children. And so what I want to talk about today is how we can understand that the undertapped, if not untapped, immense power of mirrors as a reflective force in our country. So if we toured America's schools today, what you would see is a lot of underserved Black and Brown communities. And what you'll pick up is that in almost every classroom from kindergarten to high school, you'll see lots of windows to the world and hardly any mirrors for these children. And what do I mean by that? I'm not talking about physical structures, though so many of schools do need capital improvement. When we're talking about these windows and mirrors, we're talking about something else. One, we're talking about the educators in front of the classrooms who are guiding Black students' academic success or suppressing it. And I'm not saying that simply having white teachers is bad for Black students. There are many stellar, truly gifted white educator activists who love the students they teach, that they're reflective and they're really trying to do their best for them. I know as a principal over 16 years, I hired many white educators who are conscious, committed, humble, culturally responsive, and led with a level of cultural humility. But what I am saying is that it is bad for Black students to go through 13 years of education and never have a Black teacher, or have 1 or 2 Black teachers, from kindergarten all the way through high school. And many will say, I didn't receive my first Black teacher until college. That's problematic. With Black teachers representing only 7% of the entire teaching profession in America, and in Pennsylvania, 96% of the teachers are white. That mirrors Minnesota, despite the diversity of Pennsylvania. So there's a good chance that Black students will go through elementary, middle, and high school without ever experiencing a mirror that represents them and have this shared experience. That's bad for Black students. It's bad for all students. It's bad for our communities. And it's certainly bad for this entire nation. Next slide, please. When students have teachers who reflect them, their race, ethnicity, culture, and power, they do better. When students have teachers who reflect them, their life experience, their worldviews, their aspirations, they do better. And when students have teachers who reflect the kind of person they want to be, expert, compassionate, resourceful, they do better. Better grades, they take on harder courses. They have access to harder courses. They have high expectations and unlimited potential that is not undermined. Next slide, please. Teacher-student parity has serious consequences for our Black students. Teacher expectations shape student outcomes because they become self-fulfilling prophecies. Whereby teachers expect to be right about what they thought about particular students, this also excuses their inadequacies and laziness as poor, unqualified educators, because in their minds, the limitations that they see through their clouded vision are what the students' limitations actually are. But for Black lives to matter, Black minds have to matter. If you don't expect a student to graduate, if you don't expect a particular student to attend college, you teach a certain kind of way. You approach the student a certain kind of way. You may ask a question, and if the student struggles with it, you won't challenge them. You won't go to another student and then go back to that student and ask them to expound on it. You'll say, they didn't know it anyway. Right? And so every lesson that we plan is actually a political document. And every single time we teach, it is a political statement because it is we're revealing our inner core beliefs and our mindset about the students that we serve, about these students that we may be underserving. We need district and school policies that put Black students on the same footing as white students. Those same white students that Ms. Brookins talked about being loved unconditionally in our schools. No matter teacher expectations to narrow the attainment gaps, especially when Black children are more vulnerable to negative mindsets than their majority white classmates. So there's research that shows that Black students are particularly susceptible to the negative impressions and negative mindsets and thought process and worldview about Black children in their communities. They're susceptible to that. Next slide, please. So every time we get together, every time we're leading our students, not only is the lesson plan that we develop this political document, our actions, our teaching, our questioning, how we manage the classroom, how we build community, it is a political act. A new national study found that Black students are about half as likely as white students to be put on a gifted track, even when they have comparable test scores as their white classmates. This is unconscionable. We have to fight back, we have to resist, we have to do more than disrupt it. Because disrupting may mean letting a few more Black and brown children in, but then the next year or the next semester forgetting what we did to address that. One way to stop these racial biases in assessment and expectation is teacher diversity. Some of the white teachers that I've spoken to over the past 15 years have talked about some of the best professional development that they had was being next to and in community with Black and brown educators, because they saw how these Black and brown teachers and educators interacted with the community, how they spoke about them, how they said like, oh, I was that child when I was younger. I had that perspective when I was younger. And so some of the best professional development is being in community, which means that we have to have a more diverse teaching force. Black teachers will identify Black students as gifted in reading 6.2% of the time. White teachers will identify those same students as gifted 2% of the time. Why that gap? So when we talk about achievement gaps, we often look at the students. When we talk about achievement gaps, let's start with the educators. If you take two ships that are leaving a port at the same time, and one changes the degree by 1 degree of their trajectory, their direction, 1,000 miles out, they will be a certain distance apart. 10,000 miles out, or 13 years different trajectories, the gap will be immense. So while we're focused on students and this achievement gap, let's talk about the mindset gap between educators, particularly about Black and brown children. Black students need more Black teachers, more mirrors in the classroom. And again, it's not just good for Black and brown children to have Black and brown teachers. It is good for everyone. Next slide, please. So what if our Black students saw not windows that deflect who they are in today's reality, but mirrors that reflect who they are and what the world can be? One more time, please. What will be different? How would things change? Next slide, please. Between 2015 and 2018, we saw only a 2.5% change in the books that depict Black characters based on the annual publishing statistics. One more, please. I'm sorry, did you? Thank you. During that same time, if we click to the next, well, I'll pause right there and just see. This is what, in 2015, what the diversity in children books look like. Because this message around mirrors, it's not just who leads the classroom. It is surrounded. It is in the media. It is in society. It is the images of who's in charge of what, who's in these positions. But it's also in the very books that we give to our children. Even if I'm a white child, and 73% of the books that surrounds me in my public library, in my home personal library, in my parents' library, right? If 73% depict white students or white children or white characters, what does it mean for everybody else? Next slide, please. And look at these numbers. The amount of characters from 2015 to 2018 for animals or talking cars or anything like that, doubled. A Black and brown Native American Latinx child is more likely to see a talking bear than someone that represents them in a children's book. And we're telling our students to read, read, read. But what are we giving them to read? I gave a speech a couple years ago, and we talked about this to a group of educators. And when I asked them, how many of you have diverse classroom libraries? They all raised their hands. Then I asked them, how many of you have diverse home libraries? How many of you could go to your children's bookshelf and see diversity? Half the teachers and principals and school staff dropped their hands because they were doing one thing inside the school, but they were raising their children a totally different way. We need that to come together. If we are committed to, but that's the difference between disrupting something and it's not permanent. It's not a permanent mindset, because if it's a permanent mindset, you'll do it with your own children at the same time. When Black students are taught by Black educator activists, human mirrors to reflect their racial, ethnic, cultural identity, their life experiences, worldviews, then it won't take the time it's been taken to have classrooms, libraries, school libraries, public libraries full of books and stories that also reflect them, that capture their imagination and undergird their power of learning and their academic success. We will see much sooner racial equity and parity and what's being taught to our children. Can you go to the next slide? In 2025, if we do more than disrupt. If we do more than disrupt, this is what maybe the numbers might look like. With more mirrors in the classroom, what Black students will learn, what they will read, discuss, analyze, and write will empower, inspire, and compel their own academic success. This is a very different image, very different. Next slide, please. With more Black educator activists in the classroom, not only will the what won't just be the thing that changes, but the how too. Instruction and pedagogy. If we have diverse teachers, diverse staff, instruction and pedagogy is going to change. And with those changes, Black students' academic success and confidence will explode. Because this goes beyond disrupting. Disrupting is almost rattling. We want to dismantle and recreate and reimagine in a very profound way. Next slide, please. Brain science and education research shows that instructional materials, assignments, texts that reflect students' backgrounds, their experiences and worldviews, draw from students' backgrounds, experience and worldviews, support comprehension and engagement in deep, meaningful ways. So it's not just a nice to have. You know, I've spoken to districts where they want to diversify because they want their website to look more colorful. No, it's a much deeper, more profound impact on the learning of students, the learning of adults. This is associated with a wide range of positive outcomes, having this diversity. Improved attendance, greater interest in school, academic achievement, and persistence. This connection between what we teach and how we teach and students actually learning is not new for us though, is it? So why don't teachers and principals and districts get it? Why don't we do this more often? Why aren't principals supporting this through real, meaningful, sustained professional development? Not just connect what and how they teach Black history in that month or in that day for some folks, but also the power inequities and social oppression that inhibit their academic and life success. If we started to liberate education in this kind of way, the students might just be even more open to learning, more trusting to the folks who the adults who show up in their communities to teach them. And they will believe and invest their time and energy in the American education system and process. But right now, there is a distrust because my grandfather and my grandmother on both sides, maternal and paternal, can talk about their negative experiences as Black men and women in our public schools. And they can, some of those same stories and mindsets that they experienced while they were children, their grandchildren are susceptible and experience it as well. Next slide, please. I just believe that with more Black students are taught by Black educator activists, that human mirrors that reflect racial, ethnic, cultural identity, their life experiences and worldviews, then Black history won't be mentioned 1 month in the winter, but it will be taught and integrated all year long because people would have a firm understanding that Black history is American history. Latinx history and Indigenous American history is all of our history. And so more than that, like it will be expected that schools, especially those with large Black and Latinx and diverse student populations, will be grounded in pedagogies that has shown to be successful with their students, right? So if I'm in a Black community, I'm serving a Black community, that all teachers that come to that school, for us to say that they are, we're always talking about like highly qualified and this certification. How about being, if you're teaching Black students, how about being highly qualified in what Black pedagogy is? How have Black master level expert teachers and instructors taught Black children from the continent of Africa all the way to here? there's a book called Deep Like the Rivers, and it talks about how even folks who were enslaved, who had to resist enslavement on these shores, taught younger generations, right? Because there was a pedagogy. And immediately after the Emancipation Proclamation and before that, hundreds and thousands of schools were opened, and that there were people that were teaching and teaching well, going from illiterate to literate. If they could do that, then we can definitely go from struggling to advanced. But that hasn't been happening at the levels that we need to. So when we talk about Black pedagogy, what we're talking about is crafting and nurturing this idea of school to activism pipeline. Because within it, there has to be this understanding that racial justice and social justice is forever intertwined with educational justice. And Master Black educators work with aspiring Black college students in our program. So at the Center for Black Educator Development, what we wanted to do is like really analyze how are teachers being prepared. And we wanted to use the Freedom School model, where it's an intergenerational, where we have college students and high school students teaching first, second, and third graders literacy skills using phonics, right? And who's teaching these teacher apprentices? Master level Black educators. And we're saying this is an additional pipeline. This is the way to support this, right? And so with that is not only literacy, but community pride. And what we have is freshmen in high school all the way to seniors in college who are thinking about now, hey, I want to become a teacher because I see the power in it. My work with this first, second, and third grader, I'm understanding this and they are feeling motivated. Today during our circle, we have this virtual circle every morning with the first, second, and third graders, and we give shout outs. And so many of them said, I want to we have this thing. We're like, I got a recognition. And the call and response is recognize. I said, I have a recognition. Recognize. And then the students saying, this is the best school experience I've ever had. This is a virtual 2-hour program. Why is this Black child saying this is the best school experience I've ever had? While at one point they're like, it feels good to be able to serve them and say that, at the other time it's heartbreaking. Last year, we had Black teacher apprentices, college students, who said they learned more during our freedom schools about how to teach than they did in their 3 years in teacher college. That's unacceptable. Next slide, please. So when we talk about like what would change if we do things differently, one, outcomes would change. We would see it not only in the students, remember, because we're also talking about the mindset gap and the expectations gap between the adults. So we would see changes there as well, right? When we have these opportunities, the achievement gaps will disappear. We'll see more Black authors. We'll see more illustrators of books that fill our schools and home libraries. Black families won't be looked at as consumers, but they will be known as producers of great literature because they saw themselves in it and they are replicating that. Next slide, please. And then just when we think about it, in light of this, in places like Philadelphia, where look at these beautiful Black girls. 1 out of 3 is meeting the mark in early literacy. 1 out of 3. That has to change. Next slide, please. So we talk about outcomes. The culture will change. How students are received, how they are accepted, what the expectations are, all of that will be radically different. Next slide, please. You can keep going. I'm going to skip over this, but that's basically a book fair. Just in when we look at the racist reality, I find truth in what Asada Shakur says. When she talks about that schools are reflections of the societies that create them. Nobody's going to teach you your true history, teach you your true heroes, if they know that that knowledge will set you free. And I encourage everyone on this call to help their students seek out their true history and their true heroes. I challenge you to make sure that you learn the true heroes and the true experiences and the contributions of the students that you serve. Don't just rely on the textbooks to do it for you. That's our job as educators to find it. Next slide, please. We have our work cut out for us. What happens outside of schools is so deeply and directly connected to inside of schools. So we looked at this summer of uprisings, this resistance, this demand to stop murdering us in the streets. This is all connected to inside of school as well as outside, right? And it's laid bare what we're dealing with is not just the lack of teacher-student parity in the classrooms. It shows that the lack of teacher diversity is symptomatic of something much more systemic. The brutal murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and countless others, all with names and families who will never love on them again. Their deaths laid bare in undeniable ways for those who were some kind of way blindfolded to all of this. The way that the endemic culture of racism plagues our country. So while we're talking about the current pandemic of COVID, we also have to talk about this endemic that's been happening for over 400 years. You know, an endemic that's been ingrained, systemic, and traumatizing for a very, very long time. Next slide, please. When we talk about police brutality that's been documented repeatedly, in Minneapolis, where George Floyd was suffocated with such disregard to his humanity, the police there used force against Black people 7 times the rate that they use it against white people. And nationwide, we know that Black people are 2.5 times as likely as white people to be killed by police. Police violence is the leading cause of death for young men in the United States. Over the life course, 1 out of every 1,000 Black men can be expected to be accosted and killed, right? Black adults are also 5 times as likely as whites to say they've been unfairly stopped and mistreated. I'm one of those. As a principal, I was arrested leaving my building. As a teacher, I was arrested for being at a protest. And we wonder why our Black and brown children become scared, angry, and exhausted about police and brutality and institutional racism very early on in their lives. We know that research says that as early as 3 and 4 years old, Black children experience microaggressions and racial biases. Our children experience on how policing in this country is entangled with white supremacy very early on, and that includes our public schools. Next slide, please. Historically, schools have provided no cover for this persistent, pernicious pandemic. Too often, our schools offer no refuge for the Black and brown children trying to escape racism and white supremacy. Too often, these schools are not only not refuges, not a refuge, but they also are insidious incubators of the very thing that Black and brown children are fleeing from. So I ask you, if we recognize schools perpetuate the societies that create them, how do we as educators resist endemic racism in our practice, in our teacher colleges, in our systems, and in our classrooms? How do we liberate education from the racist societal norms that have existed for generations? Next slide, please. We have to come to accept that our schools full of Black and brown students need, that they need police to be accepted, to be safe, for their safety, for their own good. But when it comes to rich white schools, people call police to protect against real external threats. When it comes to schools that are populated by Black children, the children themselves are looked at as the threats. Next call, please. Next slide, please. So the answer is not as some principals, even Black principals, may believe, that the answer is just be nice, and the politics of, use your manners when stopped by the police. We know from the public executions and murders that being nice, being humble, following directions, being unarmed does not keep you safe. Next slide, please. So as part of what we're imagining is, what does it mean to reimagine what schools look like, what safety looks like, what threats look like? Next slide. In Philadelphia, police officers and safety units is a $31 million line item in our budget. This is for in-school security, $31 million. Suppose we replace 350 officers with 350 counselors. And just suppose that with the millions left over, we funded teacher diversity, Black educator school to activism pipeline, culturally responsive and sustaining pedagogy, Black pedagogy, trauma training, more art, science, technology, etc. Next slide, please. I believe that when more Black students are taught by more Black educator activists, like Tamir Harper here, who talks about his teacher, Mr. Matthew K., human mirrors who reflect their racial, ethnic, cultural identity, their life experiences and worldviews, then leadership will change. If you don't know Tamir Harper, please follow him, get to know him. He will be Philadelphia's superintendent one day, and he's declared it now. He's a student at American University. Next slide, please. So we're talking about leadership. And you can't talk about schools and schooling and policing inside of schools and police brutality, both in and outside of schools, without talking about COVID, because it's all part of the same ecosystem. Pandemic clearly presents the extreme health disparities that make Black and brown families more vulnerable to COVID-19. And we talk about what that means for our Black students, our Black teachers, our Black families, and Black and brown communities overall. Next slide, please. This next slide has a picture of Dr. Eli Stanford, who's not only in the front line, but outspoken about the extra burden, extra anxiety, and fear that Black and brown families must face because of this pandemic. She went to a school that was priming people to be activists, whether they became doctors, whether they became educators like myself. Next slide, please. So it's no surprise that Black and brown parents don't feel good about, even as we're talking about what does the fall look like. Many Black and brown families don't feel good about this next year of school, and they face additional hardships. And according to the Center for American Progress, Black parents who have problems finding childcare not only will lose their jobs, will less likely to find a new job, and they would still have this, this difficulty of educating their children, right? Because there's a real dilemma. If I'm an essential worker, where so many Black and brown families are, and I don't have the luxury of working from home, who cares for my youngest children? So many Black and brown families are in intergenerational families, meaning do I send my child to school and risk getting their grandparents sick? We have a lot of things that we need to challenge and problem solve around. And if we have racial biases that are not deeply interrogated, that are not change radically more than just disrupting, then we are going to continue to face new issues that address that exacerbate the racist realities that Black and brown children have already. Next slide, please. So we're not just talking about mirrors in our schools. We're not just talking about who leads the classroom. We're talking about people who write the curricula, people who decide the instructional approaches, people who define what safety and security is in our schools, people who get to respond to survey questions and have their democratic rights honored, people who craft educational policies, who control the money and the purse strings, people who fill the positions of power in our overall educational ecosystem. Because as Lerone Bennett said, an educator in a system of oppression is either revolutionary or an oppressor. And what are we? That's something that we should be asking every time we're writing our lesson plans, every time we're starting to teach, every time we're doing assessment or working with children overall. Like, this is what we should be thinking about. The next slide, please. And we have to do what Ella Baker says, more than disrupt, we have to think radically, right? So when this civil rights hero that we study in our Freedom Schools movement, we have to think, how radical can we go? Are they worth it? I think they are. And I know you believe they are as well. So I've been talking, next slide, please. I've been talking about mirrors and windows a lot lately. And people started to ask, like, how old was I? When I received my first Black teacher, was it high school? Was it college? Next slide. But the better question was, when did I have my first white teacher? I did not have my first white teacher until high school. I did not have my first white teacher until high school. These are my parents. They met and married in the Black Panther Party. With the Black Panther Party, one of the things that they did, while they get attention for certain things, what was instrumental in their work was feeding Black children, not only for their stomachs, but for their minds as well. This sowed the seeds for me to become the educator activist that I am today. Next slide, please. When I became a teacher, who taught me how to teach? Next one, please. Yvonne Savior. She was Pennsylvania's Teacher of the Year in 1993 and 94. These are some of my teachers in elementary school. Next slide, please. And so it makes me wonder all the time, suppose this in our educational system, if every teacher was taught and mentored by a superb Black and brown Teacher of the Year caliber educator like Ms. Savior. Next one, please. Someone not just expert in their subject matter, but also an expert in Black pedagogy. Someone who sees and embraces their work in the classroom, in the school buildings, and in the community as fighting for educational justice, social justice, and racial justice, because we should know that it's all the same thing. And only by being radical can we see what it means to liberate and revolutionize education. Next slide, please. As I've done all summer long with giving talks, I want to end with something Frederick Douglass said. What we need right now, coming out of the summer of uprisings, to leverage all we know about the potential of power of creating more mirrors for our Black and brown students. And in order to do that, it's not to light the fire. It's not the light that we need, but the fire. It's not the gentle shower, but the thunder. We need the storms, the whirlwind, and the earthquake. Next slide. And Frederick Douglass, in his last days of his life, a young Black man approached him and said, "What advice would you give in order for someone to fight against justice and fight for equality?" We're still asking that question. What his response was, agitate, agitate, agitate. And so I want to ask, how should I agitate? What does agitation look like? The good thing is there's a ton of thinking and research focused on real change. Next slide, please. We know what superficial change looks like. We also know if we have the political will and the courage, next one, please, to create sustainable change, right? Instead of superficial, let's do sustaining. Instead of disrupting, let's reimagine, recreate, and actually liberate education. We know it's harder to fight for systemic changes. Next one, please. But it's all possible if we have the will. It is all possible if we agitate the way that our children deserve and demand that we do. Next slide, please. So in closing, I still ask one last question. How will you agitate, agitate, agitate? I appreciate you all. Thank you so much. And again, my apologies for the technology snafu at the start. Thanks again for having me.
Okay. Thank you, Sharif, for the wealth of information. My head is just exploding with just everything you've mentioned. And, you know, I want to share this, that everything you mentioned, and we've had several conversations along the lines of Black and brown children and how they feel inadequate in classrooms with teachers and educators. And I had a student, and I think back to this as you shared what you shared about just so many things. A student shared with me that, you know, I valued my Black teachers. I wish I had more Black teachers, because in the classroom where I had a white teacher, they didn't understand me. They didn't get me. They devalued me. They made me feel less than. But my Black teachers made me feel powerful and empowered and appreciated. So they get me. And, you know, I think about those things. But I'd like to also move to the questions, as I mentioned that, but I want to thank you for just the reflective and powerful comments that you shared with us that we all needed to hear. One question says, there's a problem in their district, Birmingham City Schools in Alabama. It's not the lack of Black teachers, but of white teachers who are teaching our Black students who do not make the effort to connect to them. Many of our white teachers tend to lower expectations for the Black students. They don't seem to believe that our Black students' minds matter. They want to know, she would like to know how to prepare these teachers in our community. What would be your answer?
Yeah, I think two things. So, one, we have to really address pre-service. There are too many schools and systems that are expected to address broken mindsets about Black and brown children. It's way too late then. There's a reason why at the center, we start with high school and college students. If you're thinking about teaching our most precious asset in our communities, that starts early, right? And so one is who's teaching the teachers? Who's preparing the teachers on the front end? On the other side, this is why national board is so important, right? If we imagine, as Ms. Brookins has talked about, if we had 1 million nationally board certified teachers, their impact is their locus of control are the folks that are right in their proximity, right? And right now we have too few. I know Philadelphia, I'm embarrassed at how few, nationally board certified teachers we have. As a Philadelphian, I have a whole lot of pride about certain things. That's one of my embarrassing points. And so we have to look at the pre-service, who's preparing the teachers, because if you interrogate that, you'll see that that teacher learned some of that back in college, And while we talk about institutional racism, we also have to know that a lot of white children are taught white supremacy at their dining room tables and their car rides home. And so it shouldn't be that this principal is responsible for all of it. They are, and that's not fair to ensure that the entire community isn't supporting in that way. And so I think it starts very early. And so we really have to look at that. When we talk about praxis, and we also have to interrogate, like, what's your mindset about the children you're about to teach?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you for that. Another question. What suggestions do you have for getting more young people of color going into the field of education? And second, Black males specifically.
Yeah, that's a great question. I've been wrestling with, Ms. Brookins knows she's come to multiple, one, she hosted I don't know if people know this, Ms. Brookins years ago hosted, just hundreds of Black male educators and really challenged us to each one teach 1,000, each one reach 1,000, and not wait, right? And so one, I started the Fellowship Black Male Educators for Social Justice specifically to uplift the experiences and to support Black male educators. And we had 17 Black men who were part of it. They had PhDs, several of them have PhDs. Most of us had our master's degree. Most of us were good looking. And you know what? Not a single one of us had been approached in high school or college to become a teacher. Not one of us. This is 17 Black men in Philadelphia. We said, hey, let's ask our colleagues. Most of them were white women. They remembered as early as 3rd grade, someone tapping them on their shoulders and saying, hey, you'd be a great teacher. What they're saying is, hey, I trust my children with you when you get older. And there's probably a Black or brown child sitting right next to them, maybe a boy, and they're handed a basketball or something. The young white girl is told, you'll be a great classroom leader, right? And so one, we have to engage them early. We used to do these, one of our guys, Raymond Roy Pace, came up with this idea of the Why I Teach tour. And we would go around to visit schools and classrooms and talk about, this is why we chose to teach. Some of them would say, I'm having such an oppressive experience. Why would I choose this as my career? Why would I come back? Chris Emden came to one of our national Black male educator convene. Well, he came to all of them, but and one of the times he gave a talk and he said, for some Black children, the idea of considering becoming a teacher is like returning to the scene of a crime against themselves. Why would they do that? How we engage them, though, is one, through freedom schools, because Black children have this connection with racial and social justice. So many of them are activists. Tamir Harper is an activist. He's been an activist, since middle school probably, right? And he's been a leader since he entered school. Tapping into that and explaining, it's not just teaching, it's leading a classroom. And become the teacher that you wish you had and knew you needed. And if you had a great teacher like I did, play it forward. right? And so those are the ways that we can connect with them. I encourage you to visit our website and look at the Freedom Schools model that we've been working on, which is teacher apprentices. We raise money, we give them jobs, right? If you were thinking about being a teacher in high school, I don't need you driving, catching the public transportation for an hour to go flip burgers in some suburban mall. Let me pay you to work on your craft at becoming teachers. And we have a whole lot of activists who are being exposed to teaching through our Freedom Schools Literacy Academy model.
One more question. This will be our final question. There's so many in here, but and we certainly want to hear everyone's voices. But this one is asking you to share more about the Freedom Schools you mentioned.
So Freedom Schools, if you look up, so Charlie Cobb was an activist back in the 60s. He was on his way to Texas. He was a Howard University student, I believe. He was on his way to Texas to go to a workshop to learn how to be an activist, to how to be a part of the civil rights movement. But what he had heard was that there were activists in Mississippi that were still unbowed, unfazed after Emmett Till's murder. And so at one of the stops, Charlie Cobb said, I have to get off this bus and I want to just visit Mississippi because I'm hearing about the activism and why aren't they afraid? And when he got there, he met with a couple folks and they said, what are you doing? He's like, well, I'm going to Texas, to Houston to learn how to be an activist. They're like, you don't need to go there to some workshop. You need to stay here with us and get involved, and that's how you learn. So he joined a group called SNCC, Student Nonviolent Committee, what's the other C for? But Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and my apologies. Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, SNCC. He joined them, and eventually he wrote an essay saying, while we're preparing people to vote and these other civil rights issues, we need to work with the children who are being oppressed in Mississippi schools. And so he started this this idea, and it caught on. So people would have Freedom Schools, which was basically a detox center for Black children that were being oppressed in schools. Fast forward that Marian Wright Edelman wrote, had it reemerge, and she relaunched it through the Children's Defense Fund. And then all across the country, you have Black and brown people who are creating Freedom Schools, which is basically usually literacy, cultural pride, and leadership and activism all wound up inside of a school. Philadelphia Freedom Schools has been around for 20-something years. And lately we said, you know what? We want to start the center to make Freedom Schools a teacher apprenticeship program. So keeping all the literacy, the activism, the racial pride, the racial uplift, but then also add this teacher training program, which it's a teacher apprenticeship for high school and college students. You can find more information at www.thecenterblacked.org.
Well, thank you, Sharif, for spending some time and space with us today. We truly appreciate all of what you have brought to us today. I will see you on the other side, on the other projects we're working on together.
In Freedom School model, we say,